Steve's home department, mechanical, and also kinesiology. We're also joined by Steve's family. So maybe for the benefit of everyone, let me just describe to you how this plays out. Our culture here, at least in mechanical engineering, is in a defense. We simply turn the stage over to the candidate, and Steve has got a talk prepared, probably lasts 45 minutes or 50 minutes. This is the public part of the dissertation defense, and we would encourage you to ask questions as he's presenting, or if you'd like, save your questions for the end. Either is fine. And then following that, his committee and Steve, we're going to go and sequester ourselves in the conference room 2215, where we can talk to Steve a little bit more. And we'd like the rest of you to just remain here and enjoy this nice spread that's been put out there by Stephen's family. Thank you very much for doing that. So let me provide, I guess, an introduction to Stephen, who doesn't need any introduction. You know him as well as I do. I just wanted to share a few thoughts. So we recognize that the Mayan calendar, it ends tomorrow. And some people would have us believe with it the whole world. I don't believe it will. I don't think Steve believes it will. And that's not why he decided to make that today. I just want to make that clear. That is a mere coincidence. But to hedge, and because I don't want to jinx anything, I would also say that if this were my last day, I could think of no better way of spending it than to listen to a young scholar present his research findings and listen to the advancements that we're going to hear today. Steve has selected this project, and the studies that he's going to present, which have been shaped by his committee members, are really his. And what you're going to see is, from my experience at least, the most self-directed PhD research that I've been involved in. And so with that, let's let Steve take over and we'll understand why in a moment.
All right, thanks Noel for the great introduction. Thank you everyone for coming today. Title of my dissertation is an experimental investigation of human bicycle dynamics and rider skill. So humans have ridden bikes since the early 1800s, or at least bicycle-type devices. So you see here, this is a hobby horse. The video wasn't made in the 1800s. It's obviously a reenactment, but basically it has two wheels and it's able to be steered. And this is the first type of vehicle that was able to do that. Basically, this guy invented it so he could move around the gardens faster. So maybe he's like the first mountain biker. But despite these being around for quite a while, we still don't really have a good understanding of human bicycle dynamics. So in particular, we might wonder, we need to know more about how does a human rider balance and steer a bike. So we know, we steer the handlebars, we lean a little bit, but in terms of ways of measuring how much a person might be using one method versus another, we're really not sure how to do that. And we're not sure how someone might be timing those control movements. It'd also be nice if we had a way to measure balance performance. So how can we tell if one person is better at balancing than another? So we obviously know a faster rider can obviously win in a race, but if we don't care about that type of performance, we care more about maybe how stable someone is. How can we measure that? So if we're able to answer these questions, perhaps we could help improve bike training programs. So there's a lot of programs out there to both help adults who never learn to ride, programs to help children with disabilities such as Down syndrome or autism learn to ride. If we know something about what they have to learn and how to measure what they're learning, perhaps we can improve these programs. We can also perhaps evaluate how bicycle design could affect the performance of the bicycle and rider. So if I want to design a bike to help someone be more stable when they're riding, maybe someone that isn't as good at balancing, maybe an elderly person that needs assistance staying upright, how would you design a bike to do so, and is it even possible? So if we had ways of measuring these things, we could see those effects. And also, there's a lot of interest nowadays in possibly developing some assistive technologies to help riders stay balanced. In particular, especially in the Netherlands, there's a lot of, the sales of electric bicycles have really increased. So you already have a power source on the bike. Maybe we can use some of that power to help someone remain more balanced, less crashes. So with that, I'd like to just give you a brief background on bicycle dynamics. So the basic bicycle model, which is commonly used, is called the Whipple bicycle model. And this model has basically 4 rigid bodies. So it's got 2 wheels. It's got the frame, which a rider that is rigidly attached could be included. And then you've got the fork and handlebars, which pivot about the steering axis. Now, if you develop the equations of motion for this system, despite it being rather simple or seeming rather simple, I've been told that the full nonlinear equations are actually pages long. So what you can actually do is you can linearize those equations, and you come up with a fairly simple model to understand. And basically that has led to us researchers really developing a good understanding of bicycle dynamics and how an uncontrolled bicycle behaves. So here's and it allows us to really understand 2 main motions of the bike, which are the roll of the bike, which is it leaning back and forth, and the steering of the bike, so how you're moving the handlebars. So these equations of motion, once linearized, basically takes on that form, where our state vector includes the roll and steer of the bike, and we also consider 2 forcing terms. One is a roll torque, which would be caused by maybe a gust of wind blowing you, and the other one is the steering torque. So what we can use this for is we can take a look at the eigenvalues to understand the self-stability of the bike, and we can plot the eigenvalues. So on this plot, I know there's a lot of stuff going on here. We have eigenvalues plotted on the y-axis and speed on the x. And first thing you notice is speed has a big effect. It obviously changes things. But when there's no positive real eigenvalues, which are plotted with the solid line, you see that the bike is self-stable. And what self-stability means is that if the bike is moving along straight ahead and someone comes along and gives it a hit, it can recover from that and continue being upright, moving straight ahead. So that's what self-stability is. So what you notice is there's only really a small range where bikes are self-stable. Outside of that range, it's obviously up to the rider, which we're all aware that we can easily ride at speeds, at a wide range of speeds. So obviously, the human rider is a very important part of this system. And just to emphasize this, humans can ride a wide range of bike designs, even ones that have been intentionally built to be unstable or even unrideable. So here, this is Tony Doyle, who got his PhD studying bicycle rider control back in 1987. But he built a bike that basically removed the gyroscopic effects and it removed the effect of this caster or trail effect from the bike, both of which were thought to be very important for helping a bike remain stable. And you see he's able to ride it even blindfolded. So here's a bike where the guy was trying to make an unrideable bike. This bike is easily rideable. This bike here actually there's a $5,000 prize if someone could ride it. So what someone did was they basically built their own, practiced, and after a while they were able to ride it. So humans, a very important part of this system. Now, the model, the Whipple model in particular, at least so far, has limited usefulness for understanding the human rider. So, as I said before, models can explain bicycle self-stability, and they're also useful for helping us develop or test bicycle control models. So it's really not surprising that we can develop a robot or a control method that allows a robot to ride a bicycle. But where the models are still lacking is when we try to understand the performance of a human rider. So this is a video. There we go. So this guy, he's 25 years old, just learning to ride a bike for the first time. So what happened that allows him to get to this point where he can kind of wobble down the street, and you'll see once he gets down to those cars, he'll fall over. But what is he learning? How is he getting better? What's changing? And even another point is, what might differentiate this guy from Danny McCaskill, a professional mountain biker, who's able to ride across a cable on his bike. So obviously we can observe very obviously we can see he's a way better rider than he is. And, if we were to measure just them doing a very similar task, could we measure differences? What types of control is he utilizing that he is not? And those are the types of things that I'd really like to understand. So with that, here are research objectives. So one, understand how humans control bicycles. Basically the specifics of the major control strategies that we use to steer and balance. And also would like to reveal some measurements that we can make that might distinguish rider skill. To accomplish that, we've laid out the following specific aims. So first, if you want to measure what human riders are doing, you need a way to do that. So we set out to design and build an instrumented bike, and that's leading over there. And as a starting point, investigate steady state turning to investigate both how the measurements that we take with the instrumented bike, and also look at a model to interpret our results. Look at what happens as someone learns to ride, and then also look at the differences between skilled and novice riders. So with that, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the instrumented bike, which I'm going to walk over to do. So there's a couple main components that I'd just like to point out. First, in this we call it a diving helmet around the lab, but this brass protective area, there's an optical encoder that allows us to measure the steering angle of the bike. Embedded within the fork steerer tube, there's a torque sensor, which allows us to measure the steering torque applied by the rider to the handlebars. We measure the speed using a magnetic reed switch, same as a bicycle computer. This is a custom inertial measurement unit, which allows us to measure the acceleration and angular velocity of the bike frame. And all these measurements are captured by a data acquisition unit and a computer that is carried along in the back here. And that allows us to basically take measurements anywhere we want, outside, in the lab. And the other thing, there's nothing attached to the rider, so we're not, affecting the rider. You ride a bike, you ride this just like you would ride your own bike. Okay. So now I'm just going to talk about the measurements and analysis of steady state turning. I should highlight, these results are reported in a journal publication and 2 different conference proceedings. So you might wonder why steady state turning. It's because it's a very simple control task, a nice place for us to start. It's an essential part of riding a bike. So if you were to ride from here to Central Campus, you're probably going to do some maneuvers that could be described by steady state turning. And I should say that steady state turning is basically you're going around a turn of constant radius at a constant speed. This allows us to investigate rider control in a repeatable way. So we can easily say ride around a turn at this speed, and we can we draw a line on the ground with chalk, say follow this line. So we can easily control the type of variables that might affect this. And another aspect is it allows us to compare results to the model without specifically defining a rider control model. So we're not making any assumptions about the human rider in order to make comparisons. So our objectives were to drop the pointer. Take experimental measurements during steady turning, use a model to interpret our results, and also examine the effects of rider lean on these conditions. So specifically, we looked at roll angle, and steering torque. So our steady state turning model, we derived starting with the Whipple model, which if you'll remember, does not include rider lean. It has a rigid rider. And it's also linearized about upright, straight ahead riding. So you might say, well, that obviously doesn't have anything to do with turning, but it's a very simple model that's being widely used, so we thought would test how good it is for describing human riding. So during the steady turning, the roll rate of the bike, or the roll angle of the bike and steer angle of the bike don't change. And we also assume that there's no gust of wind or anything pushing on the bike. And that gives us the steady state form. And from this, we can calculate steer angle, roll angle, and steering torque as functions of basically the only things that change are velocity and the radius of the turn. All these other factors depend on the bicycle geometry and mass properties. So, to test our experiments, we looked at 2 different subjects. We looked at 9 different turn radii, 3 different speeds, which we just said ride slow, ride medium, ride fast. We looked at 3 different leaning conditions, so called it normal riding, had someone lean excessively into the turn or lean out of the turn, and people had to pedal to maintain their speed. So first results are roll angle, looking at the roll angle. So you'll see each subject's plotted individually in this case. The bicycle roll angle that we measured is plotted on the y-axis, and normalized lateral acceleration is plotted on the x-axis. And the first thing you notice is that the roll angle is nearly linear with the lateral acceleration. So basically, how fast you're going around a turn and the radius of that turn pretty much dictate how much the bike has to lean. The other thing you'll notice is that when you lean into or out of a turn, you can increase or decrease the roll angle of your bike. So the normal riding condition is the blue dots. Leaning into the turn is the red X's, out of the turn is red X's, into the turn is the green pluses. And you see the model prediction is this black line. So you see by leaning, you can shift the roll angle of the bike either one way or the other relative to what the model predicts. But overall, the model really explains the vast majority of the variation in the experimental data. And it's only ever going to really be off by about 3 degrees, which seems rather small compared to the wide range of roll angles that we were able to reach in this study. So if we move on to the steering angle, again, the measured values are on the y-axis and the model prediction is on the x. So if it's a perfect match, it'll fall on this line. And the main thing I just want to highlight here is that when you lean, you don't significantly change the steering angle. So if you're going around a turn, you lean your body, you're really not going to have to make much change to the steering angle to continue going around that turn. And more interesting results are when we look at steering torque. So this is the measured steering torque versus the predicted again. If it matched the model exactly, it would fall on this line. And you can clearly see that it doesn't really do a good job for a lot of conditions. So it does provide a reasonable fit for the normal riding condition, again, the blue dots. It accounts for about 60% of the variation in the experimental data. But when you look at when you lean, the model isn't as useful. And this really isn't surprising because our model doesn't include ride and lean. But what it does highlight is that because the model doesn't include ride and lean causes these large changes in the steering torque, we then now know that ride and lean is an important thing to account for when we're modeling steady turning in particular. So by leaning your body, you can significantly change the steering torque that you need to apply to the handlebars. So if I'm going around the turn, I lean, I'm required to change the torque I'm putting on the handlebars. And this, I bet if I asked you how are you torquing the handlebars when you go around a turn, nobody's really going to give me a correct answer. So it seems that we don't really pay attention to that very much. So to summarize, we saw that the model is useful for understanding the kinematics of steady state turning, that being the roll angle and the steering angle. So it accounts for over 95% of the variation in the experimental data. We saw that rider lean strongly influences steering torque, which suggests that lean plays an important role in controlling the bike. And we saw that steer angle was relatively insensitive to rider lean. So suggesting that steer angle as a cue is advantageous over using steer torque. So if you go around a turn, all of you probably know which way you turn the handlebars, but not which way you're torquing. So it kind of is in agreement with kind of what we can remember about riding a bike. So Now moving on, we'd like to talk about what happens when we learn to ride a bike. So we know types of control we can use. And in this, we're looking at quantifying the process of learning to ride by using measured bicycle kinematics. And those results have been presented in 2 different conference proceedings. So the motivation, as I spoke about a little bit earlier, was that we'd like to know, what do riders learn when they learn to ride? How might we be able to tell if someone's able to ride without training wheels or without a parent holding them up? How do you know when it's time to let go? And can we find some underlying skill that we can use to see where someone might be in the learning curve? So again, if we're able to answer these questions, maybe we can improve bike training programs or methods and ultimately improve access to cycling. So ideally, people aren't cycling because they don't want to, not because they don't know how. So our objective was to use measured bicycle kinematics to quantify learning. And to measure bicycle kinematics, we used 3 synchronized inertial measurement units. So these are wireless versions, basically, of the one that I described earlier on the bike frame. Allows us to measure acceleration and angular velocities, about 3 axes. I used 2 different versions for this study. The one, and you can see they're both very small. Can easily be mounted to a bike. The one on the top was developed here at the University of Michigan, and the one on the bottom is a commercially available one from Yoast Engineering. So we mounted these to 3 different locations on the bike. One on the frame allows us to resolve the roll rate of the bicycle frame. Now if we add the one on the stem, we can resolve the steering rate of the bike. And with one mounted on the wheel, we can determine the bicycle speed. So what might we be looking for when we measure kinematics? So what we do know is that there's a relationship between steering and leaning with bikes. So we know that bikes that are self-stable, as I showed you before, they actually will turn in the direction of a fall. So here's a video. This is Jody Koyman, who recently earned his PhD from TU Delft in the Netherlands. But you see this bike on the treadmill. He tries to knock it over, and it ends up steering in the direction it starts to fall, and ultimately brings itself back up and starts heading off in another direction. So we observe kind of a similar behavior when we look at human riding. So here's some data. What's plotted steering rate in red, roll rate in blue, versus time for just a chunk of a trial. And what you'll see is that during riding, the steering rate lags the roll rate, and it's highly correlated to it. So what that means is a change in the roll rate is accompanied by a similar change in the steering rate, and it occurs, if you compare where these peaks are, the steering rate peaks a little bit after that. And we can quantify this using cross-correlation. So what that means is I can calculate the correlation between these 2 signals. Now if I do that as they're pictured here, I get an R-squared value of about 0.572. And what I can do actually is I can actually calculate what that lag might be. So if I shift it a little bit, you see that this cross-correlation goes up until I find where that is the peak cross-correlation. So you see it peaks here at 0.853, and the time shift, so I shifted the steering rate back 89 milliseconds. And this is kind of what we're going to be looking at when we evaluate learning. So now, to look at learning, we collected data at a Lose the Training Wheels bicycle training camp. I just want to thank Dr. Dale Ulrich and his students for giving me the opportunity to collect data at this camp. But basically at this camp, kids come in without the ability to ride. They're kids with different disabilities, being mostly Down syndrome or autism. They'll come in, it's a Monday through Friday camp. They'll come in once a day for 5 consecutive days, 75 minutes per day. Now they start out on these adapted bicycles. So it has a tapered or a crowned roller in place of a rear wheel. And what that does is it allows the bike to behave somewhat similar to a real bike, but also provides some stability. So here's what that looks like. So you can see it tips back and forth a little bit. like a real bike would, but doesn't fall over. Obviously, you can pedal very slow without major, it's not that difficult, which is great for learning. And you see each subject is accompanied by a trainer that kind of keeps an eye on them, motivates them, catches them if they start to fall. So, with these rollers, you can actually change the roller on the back to alter the dynamics of the bike. So most riders, when they come in on the first day, will start on roller number 3 here. And as they show improvement, they get to move up to the next roller. Improvement is judged by basically the person that runs the camp, and they're watching for, is the kid pedaling? Are they steering correctly? Do they seem kind of relaxed? And are they leaning their body appropriately so they're not kind of doing anything strange? Now after they get up to roller number 6, they get to move on to a real bike. So everybody tries the real bike on the last day of camp, whether they made progress or not. For this study, we looked at 15 different riders. They had a wide range of disabilities. Most of them had autism. And we didn't give any special instructions to the riders in the study, so we just put the sensors on their bike, started them occasionally, and collected data, but they just experienced the camp just like all the other kids. So our primary hypothesis was that steer rate would become more correlated to the roll rate as the kids trained longer and learned. So that's the plot I showed earlier, that type of idea. So now some results. I'm just going to show you the results from one subject first to orient you to the plots. So this is subject B, plotted on the y-axis. This is that cross-correlation that I talked about. And then on the x-axis is training time in days. So for one day, for day 1, I collected 3 trials, therefore there's 3 points there. The solid dots are for trials that the child is on the adapted bike that I showed you, and the open circles are for when they're on a real bike. And you see this subject kind of shows what we were hoping we would be able to measure, which is that this correlation increases the longer more time they spend in the camp. So now the results of all subjects. So the 11 that learned to ride by the end of the camp are plotted in blue, and the 4 that did not are plotted in red. Now overall, we did find that the peak cross correlation, or this R-squared value, did increase significantly with training time. So they are in fact learning to steer in the direction that the bike is tipping. But what you probably notice is that it doesn't increase similarly for all riders. So if you look at rider M, perhaps, it's clear that this subject was able to utilize his time on the adapted bike to gradually learn the skill that he needed to ride the real bike. However, if you look at, for instance, subject D, this subject does not seem to really benefit, but as soon as he was put on the real bike on the last day, he was able to do it. So this suggests that maybe there's some room for improvement, I guess, with the protocol that the camp uses. Maybe moving a kid to a harder roller before he's thought maybe to be ready for it might be beneficial for some children. So if you remember that lag time or shift that I talked about earlier, the mean across all trials was about 90 milliseconds. So this is just kind of a summary of all those previous plots. So this is the highest cross-correlation value that those that learned to ride reached, the average of all those, compared to the average of the highest value that those that did not learn. And what you see is those that learned achieve a significantly higher peak value than those that did not learn. So it seems like maybe there's some threshold that needs to be reached before a child or a human is able to ride a bike. So to summarize, we showed that riders learned to steer into the lean, and we were able to quantify this by computing just the peak cross correlation between steer and roll rate. We believe that this suggests training methods should allow the bicycle to roll. So obviously, if you're learning to steer the way the bike starts to tip, if what you're learning on doesn't allow that, you're never going to be able to, you're not experiencing that, how can you possibly learn to steer in the correct direction? But I also want to highlight that learning to balance is only one part of riding a bike. So that previous statement might have felt like I was bashing training wheels, which aren't the best for learning to balance. But when riding a bike, you need to know how to pedal. You need to know how to start and stop. You need to know how to avoid obstacles. And these are all skills that you can learn with the bike on training wheels. So, and it allows you to learn these skills independently of learning to balance. So now that I've talked about learning to ride, I'd like to talk about what is skill. How can we look at a very skilled rider versus someone that might not be as skilled? So to motivate this work, as I talked about earlier, analytical analyses of bicycle rider stability have limited use at this point for understanding human behavior and performance. So for example, if we have a control model of a rider, it's not clear yet how a certain parameter might be related to rider performance or rider skill. And what we need is more experimental measurements to really determine what might be at play. Specifically, we'd like to understand maybe how to measure different control strategies and quantify them, and also identify things that we can measure to quantify rider skill. So previously, riding skill has been assessed in a wide range of ways, both on bicycles and motorcycles. So for example, researchers have measured the number of errors that a rider commits for a specific riding task. And these tasks are pretty entertaining, I think. So this is schematic, this is a picture. But basically the rider is required to ride through these two chalk lines, and these are blowers that the researchers would flip on to try to blast the person over. And obviously they're seeing whether someone can stay between those two lines. So in this task, they had children ride by these cones. There's tennis balls on every other cone. So you had to grab a cone, move it to the next cone, grab the tennis ball, move to the next cone. And here's the schematics of how that was laid out. And obviously they're seeing whether they drop a ball. This one here I thought was pretty funny. But you have to ride between these lines. The rider needs to look behind them and read the number on this card. And they're seeing, can you look behind yourself and stay in the lines? So I don't think many of us are doing these things on a regular basis with rider bikes. So they have kind of limited usefulness. People have also looked at time to complete a course. Obviously we have races nowadays that can do that. But the idea being maybe a different bike allows you to ride faster, more easily. So here's just a typical course that's often used, weave around the cones, turn and come back. And if you go outside the lines or knock over a cone, there's a time penalty. So the other thing people have noticed is that skilled riders phase their steering torque to their body lean differently. So here's a result from, this is for riding a motorcycle and you're changing lanes. And this is for a novice rider. So this is rider lean in degrees versus steering torque. So you see, it starts and they kind of trace out how it goes, traces the rider lean versus steer torque throughout the whole maneuver. And if you compare that to a skilled rider, you can easily see that there's a qualitative difference between these two. So a couple people have looked at this, both Rice and Krem, and that's really all the further they got, was noticing that there is a difference. So obviously changing a lane, we don't have like bike highways around here that we're constantly changing lanes. So, this might have limited use. So for our study, we really wanted to try to find a way to evaluate something you do every time you ride your bike, which is obviously keep it balanced. And to do that, we looked at bicycle riding on rollers. So rollers are a traditional bicycle training device. They've been around since the late 1800s, so they've been around quite a while. And basically there's two wheels on the back that the rear wheel sits in, and it drives a pulley which drives the front roller. And as you can see, the riders are required to both stay balanced and not ride off of the rollers. A lot of people say that riding on rollers is more difficult than riding if you're just riding over ground. So we thought that riding on rollers would be a useful thing to use to kind of expose the differences between skilled riders and less skilled riders. So we didn't want these sorts of things to happen to our subjects, which is pretty entertaining. So yeah, to prevent this from happening to our subjects, we built a platform to allow the person to easily put a foot down if they had to, have a nice railing that someone can grab hold of. We also had the riders wear a harness attached to the ceiling, so in case they did fall, nothing catastrophic would happen. Now the rollers were custom built, but basically they utilize a commercially available drums and belt, but a custom frame. In particular, the frame allows the front roller to be adjusted very precisely to make sure that we can make riding on the rollers as similar as possible to riding over ground. So for the study, we looked at 14 subjects. We looked at 7 cyclists, and these are who we consider to be our skilled riders. Cyclists were all members of a cycling club or race team. They all race. They've all trained on rollers before. Our non-cyclists know how to ride a bike, but they obviously don't race. They might ride occasionally. They might commute by bike occasionally, but they've never done any competing, and none of them had ridden on rollers before. So we had them ride at 5 different speeds. So obviously riding on rollers, your actual speed is 0, you're not going anywhere. But by measuring how fast the wheels are spinning, that obviously relates to a speed that you'd be moving outside. All the riders rode the instrumented bike, which allowed us to measure steer angle, steer rate, steer torque, and the roll rate of the bike. And it also allowed us to calculate the steering power that the riders were using to steer the bike. So we mounted the rollers on a force platform, which is located here, and that allowed us to measure the ground reaction force and moment acting on the roller, bike, rider system, and ultimately allowed us to calculate where the center of pressure was and center of mass. And I'll talk about those on the next slide. We also used the motion capture system to accurately measure the roll angle of the bike. And I just want to thank Dr. James Ashton Miller for letting me use his lab and equipment for this study. Thanks. All right, so brief overview of center of mass, center of pressure, and rider mean. It's pretty important for understanding the results. Center of pressure, this is the point at which the ground reaction force acts on the bike rider system. We're mainly interested in the lateral position of this, so this is a view of the rider from behind, and we're only interested in the lateral position of the center of pressure. So this is the center of mass of the bicycle rider system. And again, we're only interested in the lateral position of that. We also looked at as I said before, the bicycle roll angle. So this is the angle that the bicycle makes it vertical. And we also defined something called the center of mass roll angle, which is the line connecting the center of pressure and the center of mass, the deviation of that line from vertical. So the reason we did this is because we'd like a way to quantify this type of movement. So this is my brother riding across a pike. You see he's using a lot of body movements relative to the bike frame to stay balanced there. So all these movements, we call those rider mean. And we define a rider mean angle, which is simply the difference between the center mass roll angle and the bike roll angle. So it's quantifying how much you're able to shift the center of mass of the system from the bicycle roll angle. So we hypothesized that the positions of the center of mass and center of pressure would be highly correlated. So this follows from looking at studies of human balance and human walking, or even pendulum balancing. So obviously the bottom needs to stay, under the balance point of the pendulum for something to stay balanced. So we hypothesized this to be highly correlated. Similar to the previous study looking at learning, we hypothesized that the steer rate would be correlated to the bicycle roll rate. Rider lean would be correlated to the bike roll angle. And we thought skilled riders would use significantly less effort, effort being defined by positive steering power and variation in the steer and rider lean angles. So now some results. First thing I want to show is the lateral position of the center of pressure in blue and lateral position of the center of mass in red versus time. And this is just for an example try. And what you immediately notice is the center of mass follows closely the center of pressure. And similar to what I showed before in the previous study, we can quantify this similarity using cross-correlation. Now, if we look at the results for all subjects, so this is that cross-correlation goes from 0 to 1 versus speed. So again, look at 5 different speeds. The top 2 are pretty close together. So here, cyclists are plotted with the blue stars, non-cyclists with the red squares. And what you see is that cyclists maintain a higher correlation than non-cyclists. So cyclists in blue, higher correlation than the non-cyclists. And this we think does a nice job of really quantifying balanced performance. So higher correlation, you're more balanced. You're doing a better job based on the skilled cyclists are better to do a better job than the less skilled non-cyclists. So how could we be achieving balance? Well, we're steering the bike. So this is bike roll angle plotted in blue versus the steering rate plotted in red. So sorry, roll rate in blue, steering rate in red. And this is similar to what I showed in the previous study. But again, these are highly correlated, and the steer rate lags the roll rate. Now, if we look at the cross correlations for everyone, so cross correlation on the y, speed on the x, we see that non-cyclists basically maintain a higher correlation than non-cyclists. So we interpret this as the non-cyclists are using more steering control than the cyclists are. So if you remember from the previous slide, cyclists achieved a higher level of balance performance. So if they're not steering as much as the non-cyclists, perhaps they're using another form of control. So if we look at, let's look at rider lean control. So here I plotted the bike roll angle in blue and the rider lean angle in red. And what you see is these are, again, correlated, but you're leaning opposite to the direction of the bike. So if this hand represents the bike and this represents the rider, this trial is showing something like this. So you're leaning opposite to, but almost equal to what the bike is leaning. And then if we look at the results for all subjects, again, this is the cross correlation, and this is speed. We see that cyclists maintain a higher cross correlation than the non-cyclists. So we interpret this as the cyclists are more effectively using rider lean than non-cyclists. And this is a very subtle motion. It's just almost like a learned response where as you pedal, the bike's moving underneath you, and cyclists have learned to move their upper body appropriately to maintain a high level of balance. So the other thing we can look at is effort. So compared to non-cyclists, the cyclists use significantly less power to steer the bike. So this is average positive steering power in watts versus speed. And you see the cyclists use very little power. So this is 0.1 watts. Generally, when you're riding your bike, you're using almost 100 watts to pedal. So this is a very, very, very small part of that. But you see that non-cyclists use significantly more. So if we look at the standard deviation of the steer angle here in degrees versus speed, again, cyclists don't steer as much as non-cyclists. And then if we look at how the riders are leaning relative to the bike frame, we see that cyclists are leaning less than the non-cyclists are. So overall, cyclists are able to achieve high levels of balance performance using a lot less effort than the non-cyclists are. So again, just to summarize, we saw that center of mass, cross-correlation of center of mass to center of pressure is able to quantify balance performance. Cross-correlation of steer rate to roll rate can quantify steering control. Rider lean to bicycle roll quantifies rider lean control. And that skilled riders achieve a higher level of balance using less steer control, more rider lean control, and less control effort than non-cyclists. So with that, brings us to our overall conclusions. So this is me riding and thinking about all the different results. So the first is that we conclude that rider lean plays a really important role in both steering and balancing a bike. And this is actually in contrast to what a lot of other people have found or have thought. So when you look at someone riding, you can clearly see them steering, but no one's going like this, right? No one's moving their body a lot. And based on that type of analysis, a lot of people have thought, well, leaning isn't really that important. But I think our results show that leaning is very important. So in the steady turn results, it showed that leaning can really influence the steer torque of the bike, which ultimately allows you to steer the bike with no hands, right? And then in this last study, I showed that cyclists were able to achieve higher levels of balance performance by using rider lean more effectively than the non-cyclists. So I believe it is an important part of balancing and steering. The other point is that achieving balance requires correlating these control movements, steer and lean, with the movement of the bicycle or the bicycle roll angle. And this, I think, has very important implications for those that are learning to ride. So, and I think as a society, we're starting to recognize this by the recent popularity of the balance bikes or strider bikes. But in order to learn the correct control movements, you need to be experiencing what you're supposed to correlate those movements to. So if the bike isn't tipping back and forth, you're never going to learn to lean appropriately or steer. So I think this provides more evidence that maybe training wheels aren't the best for learning to balance, which I think a lot of people recognize. And with that, I'd just like to highlight some areas for future work. First, just following from that, the study on the bike cam, I'd just like to confirm that, I think it would be useful to confirm that people that use other ways to learn to ride exhibit the same trends. So if we look at someone that learns to ride using a strider bike, do they in fact learn to correlate steer rate with roll rate? And I believe they will, simply because we measured that on our cyclists and non-cyclists. They showed the same trend, or same skill. Next, I think it's important to probably quantify similarities between riding on rollers and riding a bike over ground or outdoors. So are the dynamics similar enough that our results from the last study would be useful for looking at riding over ground? And similarly, can we use those same measurements to detect differences between cyclists and non-cyclists over ground? But I think the most interesting area to apply this would be to evaluate whether bicycle design can have any effect on either the performance of a rider, the control strategies that you might use, or even the amount of effort that you need to use to remain balanced. So if I give someone that might have difficulty riding a normal bike, a bike that's been designed to be more stable, does that in fact increase their balance performance? Can they ride more stably? Can they use less effort? So I think these type of measurements now would be interesting to see whether bicycle design can really influence the performance of the bicycle rider system. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Dr. Noel Perkins, for all his support and resources that made this work possible. And with that, I'd like to answer any questions you have. So, thanks.